the hum or interference of an old TV. The picture changes to a gray hue. People with coupons in their hands against a backdrop of empty shelves. Close up. A wad of depreciating rubles in a coat pocket. But behind the bright facade, another world was already maturing. A world where empty shelves became the norm and sugar coupons were the hardest currency. A time when yesterday's ideals began to depreciate as rapidly as the rubles in the pocket of an old coat. Welcome to the USSR of the 1980s. An era we will never forget. The 1980s began with a celebration that was supposed to show the whole world the triumph of socialism. For ordinary people, the 1980 Olympics in Moscow became an encounter with an alien civilization. For the first time, juice boxes with straws, canned beer, and the incredible taste of Pepsi-Cola appeared on store shelves. At the beginning of the decade, the life of the average person seemed as stable as the granite pedestal of the Lenin Monument. The morning began with the sounds of the anthem from the radio and lively calisthenics. An interesting fact: in 1980, Moscow became the cleanest and safest city in the world, as all unreliable elements were removed beyond the 101st kilometer. For children, the 80s began with the cult of the Olympic bear. His image was everywhere, from badges to giant rubber toys. But behind this facade lay a severe shortage. To buy basic Adidas sneakers, which were then manufactured in the USSR under license, you either had to have connections or stand in line for hours. It was a time when things were not thrown away, but repaired endlessly. Plastic bags with bright foreign prints were washed and dried on clothes pegs. They were a status symbol, almost like an expensive bag today. People lived in a world where information was rationed, and the main entertainment was going to visit friends for tea, where they discussed everything at the kitchen table, from sausage prices to the war in Afghanistan, which was only whispered about at the time. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, the country plunged into a strange state of morning marathon. Classical music was constantly playing on television, which was a sure sign for Soviet citizens that another general secretary had died. Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB, came to power, and the lives of ordinary people changed dramatically. A struggle for discipline began. You could be going to the movies for a matinee or standing in line for bread, when suddenly people in plain clothes would come into the room and check your documents. Why aren't you at work? It was a period of fear and hope for the restoration of order. At the same time, everyday life remained ascetic. An engineer's salary of 120 to 150 rubles was considered the norm, but buying anything worthwhile with it was a quest. Few people know that it was in the early 1980s that the first home computers, such as the BK0010, began to be introduced on a massive scale in the USSR. But for the average person, the limit of their dreams was an electronica cassette player. Music was still under strict control during this period. The lists of banned foreign bands even included Kiss and AC/DC, propagating violence. However, young people were already busy copying cassettes, creating a culture of magnetopublishing. Life during this period was a balance between the official dullness of slogans and the vibrant world of underground culture, which was already beginning to bubble up in basements and communal apartments. 1985 became a point of no return. The young and energetic Gorbachev proclaimed a course of perestroika. For the average person, it initially appeared to be a peculiar campaign against alcoholism. Vineyards were cut down, weddings became alcohol-free, and kilometer-long lines formed for vodka, which were called Gorbachev's news. But along with this came glasnost. Suddenly, it became possible to talk about things that had been silenced for decades. Magazines and newspapers became more interesting than detective stories. People devoured Novi Mir, which published previously banned works by Solzhenitsyn. The program Vzglyad appeared, turning the concept of television upside down. Hosts in jeans, live broadcasts, and rock music. The life of the average person was filled with new sounds. Viktor Tsoi's "Pearman!" changes could be heard coming from every window, even though Tsoi himself was working in the Kamchatka boiler room at the time, throwing coal into the furnace so as not to be charged with parasitism. It was a time of incredible enthusiasm. It seemed that socialism was on the verge of becoming humanized. It was during these years that the first cooperatives appeared. Yesterday's engineer could open a workshop for boiling jeans in his own bathroom. It was a moment when the Soviet people first tasted entrepreneurship, mixed with the smell of chlorine and cheap Indian paint. The late 1980s were the era of video salons. Yesterday's red corners turned into places of pilgrimage. For 1 ruble, the price of 5 loaves of bread, you could watch The Terminator or Star Wars in a nasal, monotonous translation. This window to the west was open around the clock. Fashion reached its peak. Comb bangs, generously sprayed with Preely hairspray, acid-colored leggings, and those very same boiled jeans, which were boiled in pots with bleach. Interesting fact, due to a shortage of sports equipment, young people flocked to gyms in basements, which they equipped themselves, welding barbells from trolley wheels or elevator counterweights. In 1988, Moscow hosted its first beauty contest, Moscow Beauty, which came as a shock to conservative society. But everyday life was becoming increasingly difficult. Ration cards for sugar, soap, and vodka appeared. Store shelves were rapidly emptying, but at the same time, markets, flea markets, were flourishing. There, you could buy everything from Japanese double cassette players to the first cooperative pies. Soviet people learned to survive in the wild market without yet understanding what lay ahead. It was a time of contrasts, empty state-owned stores and commercial stalls bursting with imported consumer goods, which began to spring up like mushrooms after rain. 1989 marked the end of the Soviet way of life. The first McDonald's, which opened in Moscow in January 1990, became a symbol of the end of an era. People stood in line for 5 to 6 hours just to try a burger that cost half a day's wages. For many, it was not about food, but about joining another world. Psychics took over television. Kasparovsky and Chumak charged cans of water through TV screens, and millions of people sincerely believed that this would cure all diseases. It was a sign of deep confusion in society. The old world was collapsing. The Berlin Wall fell. Republics declared their sovereignty, and television increasingly showed empty shelves and miners' strikes. People of the 80s, who began the decade with faith in a bright future and the Olympic celebration, ended it standing in lines for bread, holding a wad of depreciating rubles in their pockets. But it was these 10 years that gave us the best music, sincere cinema, and an understanding that the world is much more than 1/6 of the land. The 80s are gone, leaving behind the smell of Chinese Badras tea, cassettes with Tsoi's songs, and the eternal feeling that we are waiting for change. It was a decade when one country was dying, and another, completely unknown, was just beginning to be born in pain and hope.